What's up, guys? So when you paint large clusters of plants all bunched up together in an oil painting, it's so easy to overlook all the details that you could potentially paint on there. Because let's face it, there's a lot of small things to cover, and who has time to do all that? You have a lot of different types of plants and flowers clustered together, and so how do you get around to actually painting them? Well, first off, you simplify the steps. Don't look at the plants as a whole. Think in terms of shadows, large shapes, and equally as important, gradients. You're going to see a lot of transitions from dark to light, and so here we're going to be painting that. We are going to be working from big to small and in layers. So let's get started. As you can see, I already have a flower bush painted here, and it was from my previous video on how to paint a simple plant. Now I'm going to further elaborate around it by painting a garden full of various foliage. I start off with a baseline color, a pretty neutral green with varying depths of value. Then what I do is start painting the foundational colors all around here. I'm using an assortment of different shades of green here because since the plants will have a variety of color and shades of light, I will lay out a foundation of these random colors all over the place. The darker parts will serve as the foundation for the shadows, whereas the lighter parts will be the topmost parts. As I'm doing this, I'm blending together some areas, but leaving alone some of the other parts. Keep this in mind for this whole video. I'll be doing both blending of some parts, but some parts I'll leave a more rigid and defined area. Since I am using acrylic paints, the paints dry much faster than oils, so you will have an easier time doing both blending immediately in some spots, and leaving other parts alone to dry for the next step. Okay, so once I am comfortable with the layout of this part, I now move on to start painting the more defined shadows. So here in this small section, the shadows are going to be more vertical because I want to put some vertical oriented plants here. Try to keep the brush as wet as possible here for more accurate brushing. Use dark green and maybe some black in some spots. Now let's move over to another spot. Here the leaves will be more horizontal oriented, and so I'm using horizontal brushing to get an idea of how the shadows and darker parts will lay out. Just get a lot of small and short brushing here and cover up some random areas. Now I'm working on getting down some actual leaves on these plants here. Mind you, this isn't the final layer, as I will come back later to add more leaves, shadow effects, and flowers. I want to get an idea of how the formation is going to be with these plants, so I'm starting to establish the layout of the land. I'm changing the colors as well, because of course you're going to have variety in that. Right now it's more bluish green, and continuing to build up the plant life in this section. I go back to the top part and add some small grass blades over the shadows, and keeping the brush as wet as possible whenever I paint long grass blades like this. On the leftmost side of this painting, I will keep it darker than the rest because I want to create a vignette effect in the painting where it helps draw the eye more towards the center of the painting. Then I go back to a darker color and further elaborate on the shadows. I stack over some dark spots in some of the areas I've just painted. So now I'm adding some lighter green here because I want to get an idea of how this area is going to look like. Keep in mind that you could always go back to correct something because it's easy to correct something in a landscape painting since it is more forgiving than other subject matter. When I get back to painting the grass, I start to integrate the gradient effect. Notice how I'm kind of creating a transition from dark to light as the grass blades go up. When you're painting these now, once again have the paintbrush wet, but in some spots you could come back and do a small amount of dry brushing to blend some of them into the background. Now I switch things up and start to add some flowers. I'm painting those vertical ones. There's a bunch of different names for them. Lupines, delphiniums, foxgloves, pick one. When you paint them, keep in mind the gradient effect. The top part should very slightly transition from light to slightly darker as you go down. This will help accentuate the three-dimensional effect. And real quick, I go back to the bush here and darken up some spots because I think I overdid the light green leaves here. Now I start elaborating more on the variety of plant life. I'm painting some reeds here and there using a different shade of green. So when you're painting these, remember of course that gradient principle, where the lighter parts come out at you and the darker parts more to the inside. I'm having these plants emerge from these clusters of leaves that I have established already. When you're painting large groups of plants together like this, you're going to have a lot of overlapping, so we're going to end up with a good amount of layers of paint. Keep in mind, when you are going to paint the final layer, make sure that detail is precise and accurate. Be creative here. Experiment with different brush strokes and see what you could come up with. Make sure to be accurate, but also, some of these you could dry brush into the background so it creates that wispy effect that gives the plants a more picturesque and ethereal appearance. If you don't dry brush some spots, everything is going to look stiff and rigid. Sure, it will be accurate to the thing that you're painting, but it's going to end up looking flat and boring. Let's go over to the right and get some more groundwork done with the shading and other preliminary layers. In this part, I will later show you some more advanced tricks to polish up your painting of foliage. Going back to this left side, I'm going to continue to stack up layers of color. Notice how the reeds I'm painting have that slight gradient effect where the yellow-green gets a little darker as it goes down. And then as I paint the bushes, the brightest parts of them are of course going to be at the top. Also, leave some room for the previous layers to be seen. Now I begin the flower layer. Of course, I'm using a variety of color, and am using the same technique as with painting the leaves. Make sure the topmost flowers are lighter and then get slightly darker as they go down. Also, when you paint them, make some of them translucent so that you can kind of see through them to the previous layer. This will continue to help accentuate that ethereal effect. Now let's go back to this right side. I want to do something different here. I want to do a lot of dry brushing and blending here so that the plants have a more cloudy and wispy appearance to add to the overall aesthetic in this painting. When I first start to add the paint, of course it's going to be a little wet, but as you continue brushing, use the residual leftover paint to gently dry brush into the background. Keep doing this while you continue to stack newer and brighter layers on top of the old ones. Use different shapes and sizes too. Okay, so now I'll go back real quick to the left side while I wait a few minutes for this paint to completely dry, and add a few finishing touches to the flowers and anything else that I feel needs to do some work. Don't be afraid to add another layer of paint over some of the flowers, since it can help add to the fullness of the color. Now let's go back here and add the topmost layer of leaves. I want to keep these leaves really small, so I'm being careful with my brushing. I'm painting small dots, and of course with some of them I'm blending them together. Now I go back and add some more flowers in some areas that need it, and continue to do so until I fill up the space with enough plant life to feel satisfied. That's the great thing about painting landscapes and especially plants. You have the opportunity to be very creative and have flexibility with what you could do here. Before I wrap up, I go over the bottom part and create a transition from this large cluster of plants into a grassland area that I'll be painting in the future. And at the top part, I help ease the transition by doing a little dry brushing here and there with the plants with the background to soften it up. I add a few more details in the backmost part of these plants as well before I feel good about the overall painting. Also notice if there are any areas that look too flat. Add some more contrast and transition in some spots if this happens. Otherwise, that's it for now. Painting large clusters of plants looks complicated, but overall, if you follow some basic principles, you could find a lot of freedom and flexibility with how creative you could be when you make these. I'll be returning to this painting later on to finish it, and so stay tuned. Let me know if you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.